Sanbonan Ma-Afrika Mahle, and welcome to another fresh and insightful episode of the Civil Society Podcast. I am your host, yours truly, Xabiso, and the Civil Society Podcast is a podcast that brings conversations that you have at grassroots level with your community right here into your space where you can share it with the people who can't be present. Today we're here to have a conversation about hashtag GBV.
Thank you for having me on your podcast. So the idea for the campaign came from the fact that when we look at social structural drivers of GBV, religion and culture often come up. And often religion and culture get blamed and bear a lot of the responsibility when it comes to GBV. And sometimes this is a misconception because we may have a lack of understanding on the role that religion and culture should actually play. And so the idea for the campaign came as far back as 2022, and we were wondering how can we bring religious and traditional leaders into one space and actually show them that this is how religion and culture are having an effect on us and how they are driving GBV, so that they can come in and lend a voice in how we address GBV using the very same religion and culture. So that we're saying who we are and where we come from is not a problem. Challenge is how we interpret our culture and use it for negative purposes.
Okay, so you mentioned how culture has a negative impact on the scourge of GBV, right? So I want to ask you, do you find that it is more prevalent in cultural areas? Where is GBV more prevalent? And in having your conversation with traditional leaders and religious leaders as well, what have been your findings in carrying out this campaign across 3 provinces?
So certainly, some of the provinces we implement in and the areas we implemented, the constituencies we implement in, for instance, Inanda is very high on the GBV hotspot list, right? Other areas like Butterworth are, I think it's number 29 on the GBV hotspot list, right? So some of them, I mean, they're basically in the top 30, meaning the cases happening there, rape incidences are very, very high. And rural communities, we find reporting of GBV cases is even less than what happens in the cities. And in the cities, research was done, for instance, in Joburg, that only 1 in 23 women ever go to report a GBV case. And when we're talking about rural areas, that being more difficult, it's because in certain instances in the families, things are kept secret. In other instances, the police stations are just too far for them to actually get access to get assistance. And then there's a whole issue of shame that surrounds it. So yeah, the rural areas certainly have a great spike in GBV cases that often go unmentioned, undetected, and unaddressed.
I like that you point out the fact that there is a culture of silence. And my next question to you is then, do you think that culture influences or has a voice in creating gender norms that dictate how people who are victims of violence report violence, experience violence, or a culture of sharing or silence within our communities about these issues?
So interestingly, when some of the research that has come up, some of the statements that we have, especially you'll find when a young lady or lady is going to get married, she'll be told a woman's place is to persevere. Persevere through it all. And this is something that we are taught and is ingrained in us. Culturally, it is ingrained in us. Sometimes the religious texts, like a woman should submit, have been used to say that if your husband beats you in your home, it's because you may have done something to offend them. Now, what I love about these engagements is we gave an opportunity to both religious and cultural leaders to actually step up, and we addressed some of these things to them. And what we noticed in all 3 provinces, the religious leaders all came up. In fact, it was religious leaders, Christian and Islamic religious leaders, all came back to confirm that their texts do not support intimate partner violence in any way, and that what we're doing is a misinterpretation of those scriptures to actually protect oppression in one way or another. And also hearing from the traditional leaders that our culture is a culture of Ubuntu, and that our culture is a culture of protecting one another and helping one another, and therefore it should not at all condone any form of intimate partner violence or sexual violence for that matter. And yeah, it was great to actually see that this is a common theme when we were having our engagements in Inanda, in rural Mtwalume, in Umtata. That's the same thing that we found when we've come even here engaging with, in Gauteng, engaging with cultural and religious leaders here.
I know that they are, I won't say adamant denial about the culture of gender-based violence, you know, when you speak to traditional leaders and religious leaders, because I have been in attendance at one of your workshops. The issue is then their value system doesn't, it speaks to a culture of peace and Ubuntu and respect for women and children, but that's not what translates in terms of our statistics. And based off that, I want you to just give me a brief outlook or analysis of, you know, what the legal framework looks like in South Africa in terms of the correlation between the statistics then, and then what our work is on grassroots level, you know, what we're experiencing on grassroots level, because clearly there's a disconnect between what we're seeing happening in reality and, you know, a sort of barefaced denial about these things actually happening in our communities.
Mm-hmm. So look, it is known that South Africa has some of the best laws and policies in the world. You know, the Domestic Violence Act, Amendment Act is really great. Sexual Offences Act, how it has been developed, is really great. The development of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence is actually a leading strategy that others are now looking at to develop a strategy for themselves. The challenge is, and has been said repeatedly, is on the implementation, right? In cases of intimate partner violence, so many times people will go to the police station to report their case, and you'll find the police official will tell the person who's coming to open an intimate partner violence case, go and make peace with your partner. You don't need to have this issue. Sometimes the police official that you meet there plays marriage counselor of sort, depending on what they subscribe to. And what we're realizing is your first responders as police and whoever else who may be engaging subscribe to some form of religion or culture. So it's part of the reason why it's important to have religious and cultural leaders in the space, because they have the avenue to disseminate the right sort of information in how things should be addressed. So that the police official knows that at no point in time should I condone violence in a home. My responsibility is to see to it that a protection order process follows through. But what they're doing is now trying to speak of a culture that sort of condones, or a religion that condones and says that you should submit or you should forgive and you should let what has happened go, you know, out of forgiveness. So if we have our religious leaders, for instance, taking up their platforms, I believe the 2011 census showed, for instance, South Africa as being 84% Christian. What if we had our religious leaders in that sect actually using their platforms to speak against gender-based violence, so that it's not something that is aside from the church, but it's something that is being spoken about in the church?
Thank you for that brief analysis and very insightful analysis, Namuma. My final question to you is, you know, as a specialist, as a person who works, you know, in these grassroots communities and speaks about the National Strategic Plan, what is your outlook, you know, 30 years post-democracy? And I would like to, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but I'd like you to evaluate the effectiveness of the work and your engagements with traditional leaders regarding this hashtag GBV is not my heritage campaign.
Look, I think one of the things we noticed as we were speaking, quite a number of the cultural leaders, for instance, said nobody has taken time to actually take them through the Constitution. a lot of them have felt that the constitution, and it's not just the cultural leaders, it's also the religious leaders, have felt that the South African constitution is very Eurocentric and doesn't relate to where we come from. And so there is a need for us to actually show the links between how this constitution actually steps up in support of our culture and doesn't deviate from it. And how do we partner that? So that we don't have a situation where religious and cultural leaders feel like this constitution is something aside from who we are, and we should not subscribe to it. A lot of religious leaders did come up and say that the constitution seems to further beliefs that don't agree at all with their religion. But it's not 100% true. There is quite a lot of room for meeting ground. And so if we're able to merge those, we might be able to form some progress. You know, speaking again, quite a number of these people we brought into the space have not heard of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence. That means key people are not being brought into the relevant conversations. Pillar 2 of the National Strategic Plan is on prevention and rebuilding social cohesion. You can't rebuild social cohesion without religious and cultural leaders in the space. And 30 years post-democracy, we need to start looking at how much are we engaging those in the rural communities, our religious and cultural leaders, in conversations that impact the community, because they have the largest platforms. If we do not involve them, we may be able to make some progress, but it will be limited.
I strongly agree with that. They truly are the backbone of our society and our social fabric. Namuma, you know, it's unfortunate that this conversation was so brief, but it was very insightful. And I'd like to thank you for joining us as well. And I wish you the best of luck in running this campaign. But it's not only your responsibility for us to run this campaign, it's all our responsibility to share and disseminate values, valuable values. You know, we've begun to lose our culture as Africans. So let's share this. Let's have these conversations within our church groups. Let's have these conversations in Dumbeni Zetu and all around in our communities as well. In finality, Namuma, what is your nugget of wisdom that you are leaving us with before uvalelisa abahlali ekhaya?
I would say our culture in and of itself is not a problem, and we shouldn't demonize it. Culture may actually be the best means through which we address GBV. And so let's look back to ourselves. There are some positive institutions within our culture that we can use to address GBV, and I would hope that we look to that.
Namuma, thank you so much for joining us for this insightful conversation.
And thank you for having me, and thank you to your listeners as well.
Without further ado, join us for the next episode. And hashtag GBV is not my heritage campaign is coming to a place near you. Follow us, Generation G, on all social media platforms. ActionAid South Africa, Activate Change Drivers, and SONKE Gender Justice. Participate in your community, make a change, especially you, Muntu Omusha. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye-bye.